In the vast, sprawling expanse of the Soviet Union, during an era defined by strict order and state control, a shadow went unnoticed for far too long. It was a time when the official narrative declared that crime was a symptom of capitalism, a decay that did not exist within the socialist utopia. Yet, in the industrial region of Rostov, a dark reality was festering beneath the surface. Between 1978 and 1990, the citizens of this region lived in a state of quiet, growing terror. People were vanishing. Children, young women, and wanderers were disappearing from train stations and bus stops, leaving behind only silence and, eventually, tragic discoveries in the dense woodlands that lined the railways. This is the story of one of the most extensive and complex manhunts in criminal history. It is a case that challenged the forensic capabilities of a superpower, revolutionized the psychological profiling of offenders, and ultimately brought a predator known as the Rostov Ripper to justice. To understand the magnitude of this investigation, one must first understand the environment in which it took place. The Rostov Oblast is a major transportation hub, a gateway connecting the north to the warm southern regions of the Caucasus. In the late 1970s, the train stations were teeming with life. Commuters, students, and workers moved in a constant flow. It was within this chaotic movement of humanity that Andrei Chikatilo found his camouflage. He was a man who looked entirely unremarkable. He was a father, a husband, a member of the Communist Party, and an employee at a factory. He blended into the gray backdrop of Soviet life so perfectly that he became invisible. The case officially began, though investigators did not know it at the time, with the discovery of a young victim in 1978. The tragedy of this first crime was compounded by a catastrophic failure of the justice system. Under immense pressure to solve the crime quickly and restore the perception of safety, authorities focused their attention on a local man named Alexander Kravchenko. Despite a lack of physical evidence and Kravchenko's alibi, the system, desperate for a resolution, convicted him. In a heartbreaking miscarriage of justice, Kravchenko was executed for a crime he did not commit. This tragic error would haunt the investigation for years to come, as the true perpetrator remained free, emboldened by the fact that someone else had paid the price for his actions. As the years progressed into the early 1980s, the disappearances continued. The pattern became impossible to ignore, even for a state apparatus that was reluctant to admit the presence of a serial offender. Bodies were found in the forest strips, the narrow bands of trees planted to protect fields from wind and snow. The locations of these discoveries revealed a chilling, methodical nature. The perpetrator was using the railway system to hunt, travel, and escape. He was mobile, intelligent, and cautious. The investigation was eventually consolidated under the code name Operation Forest Strip. It became one of the largest police operations in Russian history. The man charged with leading this monumental task was Major Viktor Burakov. Burakov was a man of integrity and intellect, a forensic expert who understood that traditional policing methods would not work against a phantom. He was facing an adversary who left no fingerprints on record, who had no obvious motive, and who struck at random. Burakov realized early on that he was dealing with a single individual, a serial offender, a concept that was technically alien to Soviet criminology at the time. The logistical challenge was staggering. There were no computers to cross-reference data. Every report, every witness statement, and every ticket stub had to be analyzed by hand. Burakov and his team created massive charts and maps, pinning the locations of the bodies and trying to predict where the offender might strike next. They flooded the railway stations with uniformed and undercover officers. At the height of the operation, hundreds of police personnel were patrolling the trains and platforms of the Rostov region, looking for anyone acting suspiciously. It was during this intense period of scrutiny that science played a confusing and controversial role. In 1984, Chikatilo was actually detained for suspicious behavior at a bus station. He was carrying a briefcase containing items that, while not illegal, were deeply concerning to the officers. He was held and interrogated. However, the forensic analysis of that era led to a critical error that would allow him to walk free. Investigators had recovered biological samples from crime scenes that they believed belonged to the killer. Based on the science of the time, the samples indicated the perpetrator had blood type AB. When Chikatilo's blood was tested, he was found to be type A. This discrepancy cleared him as a suspect. The prevailing theory, which has been debated by forensic scientists in the decades since, was that Chikatilo was a non-secretor, or perhaps a paradoxical secretor, meaning his bodily fluids did not match his blood type. Whether this was a rare biological anomaly or simply a laboratory error caused by contamination remains a subject of discussion in forensic history. Regardless of the cause, the result was catastrophic. The police, adhering to the scientific evidence they had, released the man who was responsible for the reign of terror. He would remain free for another 6 years. The investigation ground on, with morale among the task force plummeting as the victim count rose. Burakov, exhausted but undeterred, decided to try a new approach. He reached out to Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, a brilliant psychiatrist. Burakov asked Bukhanovsky to do something that had rarely been done in the Soviet Union, to create a psychological profile of the unknown killer. Dr. Bukhanovsky spent sleepless nights reviewing the crime scene photos and autopsy reports. He looked past the physical evidence and stared into the psychology of the offender. He concluded that the killer was not a drifter or a wild madman, but likely a mild-mannered man with a respectable job. He theorized that the killer suffered from deep-seated sexual dysfunction and feelings of inadequacy, using violence to assert control and dominance that he lacked in his daily life. Bukhanovsky's profile was startlingly accurate. He predicted the killer's age, his appearance, and his solitary nature. He described a man who was outwardly normal, but internally tormented. This profile would later become the key to unlocking the truth. But for now, it served to refocus the investigation. By 1990, the pressure on the police was immense. The Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse, and the social fabric was fraying. Yet, the hunt for the Rostov Ripper continued. The breakthrough finally came not through high-tech gadgetry, but through classic, observant police work. On the 6th of November 1990, a police sergeant named Igor Rybakov was patrolling a wooded area near a train station. He saw a man emerging from the forest. The man was dressed neatly in a suit and tie, holding a briefcase, but his behavior was odd. He seemed to be checking if he was being watched. Rybakov stopped the man and checked his identification. The man was Andrei Chikatilo. Although there was no immediate evidence of a crime, Rybakov noted the encounter in his report. Days later, a body was discovered in that exact area of the forest. When investigators cross-referenced the report of the body with the patrol logs, Rybakov's interaction with Chikatilo stood out like a beacon. It was the connection they had been waiting for. They checked Chikatilo's background and realized he had been a suspect years earlier, released due to the blood type mismatch. They also noted that his employment records showed he was on travel or absent from work on the exact dates of many of the murders. The pattern was undeniable. On the 20th of November 1990, police arrested Andrei Chikatilo. He was approached on the street, and this time, there would be no escape. However, capturing him was only half the battle. The investigators needed a confession. Without physical evidence linking him directly to the specific crimes, remember, this was still the dawn of DNA technology. They needed him to admit his guilt to secure a conviction. The interrogation was a grueling psychological chess match. For days, Chikatilo sat in the interrogation room, silent, detached, and uncooperative. He played the role of the confused grandfather, the victim of police harassment. He feigned madness. He mumbled incoherently. He refused to eat. The investigators, led by Burakov and joined by the prosecutor, tried every tactic in the book. They presented the travel logs, the circumstantial evidence, and the sheer coincidence of his presence at the crime scenes. Chikatilo remained a stone wall. Recognizing that the standard interrogation techniques were failing, the investigators played their final card. They brought in Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, the psychiatrist who had profiled the killer years earlier. What followed was one of the most famous interactions in the history of criminal psychology. Bukhanovsky did not yell. He did not threaten. Instead, he sat down with Chikatilo and began to read from the profile he had written. He spoke to Chikatilo about the killer's childhood, his feelings of powerlessness, his inability to connect with others, and the dark compulsions that drove him. He spoke with empathy, not for the crimes, but for the burden of the beast that lived inside the man. As Bukhanovsky spoke, Chikatilo began to weep. For the first time, he felt seen. He felt that someone understood the duality of his existence. The psychiatrist had effectively held up a mirror to the killer's soul. Chikatilo's defenses crumbled. He looked at Bukhanovsky and asked to speak. The confession that followed was a torrent of darkness. Chikatilo confessed to 56 murders. He provided details that only the killer could know. He described the locations of bodies that had not yet been found. He walked investigators through the crime scenes, acting out the events with a chilling detachment. The sheer scale of his crimes shocked even the hardened investigators who had spent years hunting him. The Citizen X they had chased for over a decade was finally unmasked as the quiet factory worker. The trial of Andrei Chikatilo began in April 1992 inches, a courtroom in Rostov. It was a spectacle unlike anything the country had seen. To protect him from the fury of the victims' families, who packed the courtroom demanding swift vengeance, Chikatilo was placed inside a large iron cage. The image of him in that cage, his head shaved, staring wildly at the crowd, became the defining image of the case. Throughout the trial, Chikatilo's behavior was erratic and bizarre. He shouted nonsense, dropped his trousers, and claimed to be pregnant. He ranted about the Soviet system, about his health, and about conspiracies against him. It was a desperate performance designed to support an insanity defense. He wanted the court to believe he was mentally unfit to stand trial, that he belonged in a hospital, not a prison. However, the court was not swayed. 3 forensic psychiatric experts had examined him and determined that while he was certainly sadistic and abnormal, he was legally sane. He knew right from wrong. He had taken methodical steps to hide his crimes, to clean up evidence, and to avoid capture. These were the actions of a rational, calculating predator, not a man in the grip of psychosis. The testimony was grueling. Family member after family member took the stand to speak about the loved ones they had lost. The court heard about the potential that was stolen, the students who never graduated, the children who never grew up. The weight of the grief in that room was palpable. The prosecutor methodically laid out the evidence: the travel records, the witness identifications, the knife found in his possession, and his own detailed confessions. On the 14th of October 1992, the verdict was read. Andrei Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 murders. As the judge read out the sentence, death by firing squad, a wave of relief and applause washed over the courtroom. The families finally had the justice they had waited over a decade for. Chikatilo's appeals were all rejected. Even Boris Yeltsin, the president of the newly formed Russian Federation, denied his petition for clemency. On the 14th of February 1994, the man known as the Rostov Ripper was executed. The legacy of the Chikatilo case is profound and multifaceted. It forced a modernization of Russian law enforcement. It shattered the ideological myth that serial crime was purely a Western problem, forcing the authorities to acknowledge the reality of psychopathy within their own borders. It also highlighted the critical importance of psychological profiling. Dr. Bukhanovsky's contribution to the case is now studied in criminological courses around the world as a prime example of how psychology can bridge the gap when physical evidence falls short. Furthermore, the case serves as a somber lesson in the dangers of tunnel vision and the pressure for quick results. The execution of Alexander Kravchenko remains a dark stain on the history of the investigation, a reminder that in the rush to find a monster, the system can become one itself. From a forensic standpoint, the case accelerated the adoption of DNA technology in Russia. and led to stricter protocols regarding blood typing and evidence handling. The error that allowed Chikatilo to go free in 1984 is a case study in how a single scientific mistake can have devastating, compounding consequences. As we reflect on this case, we are left with the chilling realization of how easily evil can hide in plain sight. Chikatilo was not a monster who lived in a cave. He was a neighbor, a coworker, a commuter on the morning train. He thrived on the anonymity of the crowd and the complacency of a system that refused to see him. The story of the Rostov Ripper is not just a catalogue of crimes. It is a testament to the persistence of those like Viktor Burakov, who refused to give up, even when the trail went cold and the odds seemed impossible. It is a story of science evolving to meet the challenge of human darkness. And ultimately, it is a memorial to the victims, whose lives were cut short, but whose memories fueled the pursuit of justice. In a world where we often rely on technology to keep us safe, the capture of Andrei Chikatilo reminds us that human intuition, psychological understanding, and dogged determination are often the most powerful tools we have. It forces us to ask ourselves, in our own communities, in the busy crowds of our daily commutes, how much do we really know about the people standing right next to us? This case stands as a historical marker, closing the chapter on Soviet criminal history and opening a new era of forensic awareness. It remains a stark reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed and sometimes imperfect, is a pursuit that must never be abandoned.